On the concept of shifting baseline syndrome, I'm not an expert on it, obviously, but that came about while looking at, it was in relation to fishing and overfishing and what was there before, and the whole discussion of quotas and what we should fish now, and that was based on a time in the past, probably the recent past, saying that there were X amount of fish in 1950, there's X amount of fish in the year 2000, so we should base our quotas on that. That looking back, relatively speaking, we're saying the 1950s was a time of abundance, but actually, historically, if you go back 200 years, there's a lot of evidence to show there were far more fish and far more abundance at that stage as regards the oceans. The same can be said of the landscape or other biospheres or other ecosystems. So basically what it means is the shifting baseline syndrome is where is your baseline historically? Is it 2,000 years ago when like for instance, if we're talking about forest in Ireland or tree cover in Ireland or woodland in Ireland, whatever expression you're using, if you're saying what is your baseline? Is it 1650 when there was either 4% or 12%, depending on whose opinion you believe, McCracken's or Everett's or those traditions, or if you go back to the year 0, we'll say time of Christ, when the country was largely covered, probably 70-80% coverage of in tree cover with very little or some people on the island. So your baseline informs your reaction to the situation that prevails now, the contemporary situation. So that makes our forest, as in native forest, oaks, alder, etc., it makes the situation we're in right now far more, it clarifies it far more. There's very, very little left. And you can talk about 1% or 0.5% or 2%, or we have more now than we had 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 150 years ago. They're not the baseline. They're not the appropriate baseline. If you go back to the year 1000, we're living here we're here in North Cork, just outside Macroom, probably would have been covered in forestry. Probably would have been covered in forestry up until the 15th or 16th or 17th century, or at least there would have been a lot of it. Well, I think it's accuracy. Accuracy is important, and especially historically. If you're making a judgment on, I think, if someone is saying, I think we should have more forests in the country, which more and more people are saying, it depends on what their definition of forestry is. My definition of forestry wouldn't be conifers. That's tree farming. That's a commercial activity. That's tree farming, if you like, plantation. If you want to restore some of the native forest, and there's lots of ecological, environmental, social and economic arguments for restoring some of the tree cover, it's good then to have a baseline or an idea of how much tree cover existed at we'll say the peak or the climax before man's intervention started reducing the forest at one stage. It's a good idea just to have an idea, even just for clarity or historical clarity, to know what was the baseline. But again, I suppose it depends who do you mean by the English. I mean, if you're talking about like a lot of people will confuse the Anglo-Normans and the early settlers from the 11th and 12th century on, they became more Irish than the Irish themselves, so they became they were Irish, but at that stage they were the Old English, as I think they were referred to in a book I read on the siege of Derry Recently. I think the consensus seems to be that by 1650 the Irish had reduced the forest to maybe, according to Eileen McCracken, 12%, according to Nigel Everett and that tradition, 4 to 5%. It could be more than 12%. It may not be. It could be more. It could be around the 4%. So, depending on who you're listening to, 80 to 90% of the forest was gone before the English ramped things up and really removed what little was left to build their navy and also to clear. And as Elizabeth referred to when she said we must clear the forests to give them the Irish rebels nowhere to hide. So the job, we had ourselves, the Irish had done a good job in removing the forest long before the English came along. But they certainly finished the job quickly and very efficiently. So, but probably by the middle of the 18th century, there was very little left, except in the great houses dotted around the country. I think there were 900 great houses around the country, and they would have been the places that some more diverse and some native and non-native species were growing, and you see that by the foundation of the state at the start of the 20th century, they were the places that what little reservoir was left was on those, and they were soon cleared and felled at the foundation of the state, because there was little resource. There was nothing there. That was all was left, really, and where we find ourselves today isn't too far from that situation.